Hi, this is Uncle Matt's D&D Studio. I'm Matt Finch, and we're here for Uncle Matt's D&D Neighborhood. So please, if you're watching and you enjoy interviews and the sorts of things that we talk about on the neighborhood or with the games, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel or go to the channel's Patreon, which is patreon.com/Uncle Matt. Now, my guest today, and I'm really looking forward to this one, is Stephen MacFarland, and your list of accomplishments and credentials and all of that good stuff in the gaming industry, Stephen, is normally what I do is so I don't force people to embarrass themselves if they're shy. I do it for them. In your case, I'm not sure I have enough memory to load in all the different things that you've worked on and list them correctly. So I'm gonna punt the introduction to you with the whole thing of you don't get to be shy. Just say what the truth is about all the stuff you've done.
Well, unfortunately for you, I'm painfully shy. No, that's not true at all.
Everyone was saying that at the conventions. They were like, that guy, he's shy.
No, so I started on this long journey back when I was 11 years old, and I went to a birthday party and ran into a D&D game for the first time. We played against the Giants. I had no idea what I was doing, but it was the most fun I've ever had playing a game. And I liked games and everything. I became obsessed with role-playing games in general, and some tabletop miniature games and all sorts of different forms of games. And then in 2000, I became the editorial assistant for the RPGA for Wizards of the Coast, for Polyhedron and Living Greyhawk Journal. Very soon, those magazines went up to the periodical section, and I ended up being the content manager for the RPGA, which mostly meant the Herculean task of running the Living Greyhawk campaign and all of the things we produced for it. And I did that for a good many years until I finally said, enough's enough, and I quit. And I went home and sold off collectibles and stuff to pay my rent. And then Wizards of the Coast called me back and said, hey, do you want to come back and develop the D&D game, and which I did. Over that time, when I was in the RPGA, I was on the development team. I was the organized play coordinator for the 3.5 revision. I came back and mostly worked on 4th edition D&D and Saga Star Wars edition when I was at Wizards of the Coast. I also started teaching game design about that time, and I had done Paint Masters for the D&D and Star Wars line, where I basically paint a miniature and they send it to China and they reproduce it and everything else, and some smatterings of cartography and all sorts of fun stuff. And then, like anybody who works long enough for Wizards of the Coast, you eventually get laid off, which I did. But luckily, my friends over at Paizo almost immediately contacted me and wanted me to do some freelance work for the Advanced Player's Guide for the newly released Pathfinder role-playing game. And I did some freelance for that and Ultimate Magic. And in short order, they said, hey, do you want to come work for us? And I said, yes, I do. And I've been at Paizo for nearly 7 years now.
So we're talking about, these are the credentials of the serious game veteran there. And what I want to do is I want to run in and begin talking a little bit about game and possibly adventure design if we swing into that, but game design. Because one of the things is that you and I are often seen as representing two different poles of fantasy gaming. And we'll get to that. But first, one of the signatures, one of your hallmark signatures seems to me to be elegance in the game design. That you usually have the a single resolution mechanic. You've got various different strategies that could be used with that, and those as classes are developed into various granular elements. Each class has the same structure of how those granular elements are going to be used together, and then each one of those has it implicates certain strategies that they're going to take toward playing the game. So tell me, first of all, whether you agree with that as a general definition of the word elegance, but then, why don't you go into that concept? Why is that Why is it important? What does it do? So on and so forth.
Sure. I actually think that's a pretty fair assessment. And I definitely didn't come there at first. My early design back when I was a fan, and even coming into it as professional, I started looking at underlying structures of the game and listening to people and what they liked about the game and what they didn't like about the game. And over time, and about games in general, I'm kind of a game design wonk, I guess you could say. But I found that people love to customize their bits, right? This is the benefit of Dungeons and Dragons. This is the benefit of Pathfinder. This is the benefit of Magic the Gathering, 40K, like any game that's out there that people can live in and obsess about and everything else. It's a lot about what I can do with it, what I can create with it, either on the player or the GM side with role-playing games. At the same time, there's this concept of game balance. And a lot of people struggle at what game balance is in role-playing games. And over time, I figured out that if you could have an underlying structure that was similar, but different enough to take in all the archetypes, of kind of classes that people wanted to play, or even kind of adventures that people wanted to create, you could create underlying architectures that would satisfy that idea of balance. But you make those robust enough to be understood. So if you start playing the game and you start playing the game in one direction and you realize, oh, I don't like this direction very much, you could easily flip to another one. So
now let me interrupt you for just a moment. Sure. Because we're throwing around the term game balance, and there are a couple different interpretations of what that means.
There are.
And I think it would be a good idea to nail down what we're talking about, because the two definitions of game balance that are out there, I think there is a wrong one. At least it seems to me it's the misuse of the term, but I think there's the wrong one, that it's the idea that everything that the players ever encounter ought to be appropriate for their abilities, and that therefore everything should be roughly at the same challenge level. And then I think there's the right one, which is you don't ever want one player character to constantly be in the spotlight because of them being stronger than all of the others. So let's jump. Do you agree with that right wrong thing? Which sense are you using game balance in?
No, I think I agree with your major premises. Now, I think I kind of see it, well, maybe I do and maybe I don't, is kind of a broader band. I definitely, and any of my players can tell you this, believe in creating really rough encounters. Sometimes that the right answer is to run away. Sometimes the right answer is to find ways for the environment to help you defeat the encounter. Sometimes I just kind of want to grind you into the dirt for a little bit. I also, on the other end, sometimes road bump encounters, mostly ones that help move on the story or sort of explain the story, are also very useful. And most of your encounters sit in that middle range. There was an old living, what did we call that? It was Scion of the Green Regent, and it was like the first adventure we put out for it. And I had this sort of, you could go into a section that was pointing into the Underdark, and there was these ruins, and you could read the ruins, and it was basically mind flayers telling you, come no further. And then you
get the fuck out.
Basically. And then you went a little way longer, and there was another one. And then some groups kept on going, and I put a bunch of mind flayers in it. It just decimated characters, right? And it was a encounter that I knew was going to kill people. It was like, no, they're not going to put anything that'll kill my character in there. But it helped set up later things in the story. So yeah,
okay, so you're saying that sort of with me, you're in the idea that the game balance against the monsters is certainly not something that has to be mathematically precise, and it probably gets worse and worse the narrower the band gets on that.
Agreed.
And so when you are talking about game balance in the game design, I take it you are talking about the characters vis-a-vis each other so that nobody gets the spotlight too much. Is that?
That's part of it. There's also a verisimilitude aspect of it, right? I mean, we play these games. You could look at it as purely a mathematical metagame thing, and a lot of players do. And I tend to look at it quite a bit as that way as well. Where you know, finding that awesome combination that makes all of your other players feel like they're not playing the right character. You know, long discussions on internet boards about what powers are overpowered, and whatnot. You want to try to avoid those whenever possible. Of course, the more you avoid them, you sort of just kind of shrink it, and every game sort of sees this, where even if you're really close, the stuff that is quote unquote overpowered might not be drastically overpowered, but then you still have, you know, the mechanics wonks having those conversations about, you know, oh, that's OP. You see that a lot in MMOs. MMOs are really good at constraining sort of what's overpowered, mostly nowadays. But people still, you know, they're still looking for the best thing. Now, when the best thing becomes an exploit that breaks the game, that's terrible game balance and has to be fixed. But I think the goal is having enough room where people can find, you know, the tools to help them do what they really want to do with the character with as much proficiency as possible. But if that gets out of whack, then play for everybody, even the players who find those exploits. And you know, that's only fulfilling for about 4 or 5 times, and then it becomes kind of boring, unless you're really that kind of person who just likes to dominate a table. But it's a group game. You have to be able to, as one of the biggest challenges of a GM is making sure that the individuals and the group are having a good time. And I do think that mechanics can help with that. GM skill, of course, can overcome bad mechanics, but GM skill with good mechanics just makes GMing even easier.
Mm-hmm. So circling back then, how would you define the concept of game balance as you, in terms of interacting with the elegance of the system itself?
I think underlying the system, you have to have a good sense of where your numbers are sitting and how they interact with one another. And that goes for the player side versus like GM numbers. Like, take a look what the player numbers are, figure out where the monster numbers are, what is your degree of success. And I particularly enjoy, remember that the D20 is a big ball of variance, and learn to, you know, live and love that variance. The other thing is taking a look at how classes compare to one another, what kind of roles they sit in, and make sure that those are fulfilling not only on an individual level but a group dynamic level.
Okay, so we have got let's go ahead and get on to where you and I tend to have what appears to be a very big disagreement, because, for example, 3rd and 4th edition are the versions that I pretty much just won't play, right. And you wrote them, so it would appear that there's an enormous difference between the two of us in terms of the way that we approach what a D&D, and we'll just throw Pathfinder in with D&D. You know what I mean, D&D concept game. In terms of how, sorry? Inspired by, exactly. Yeah. Well, so you just don't want to get caught up in all of the trademarks and trying to use the right terminology. So, in terms of how a game should run, mm-hmm. Give me a description of how of you running a game using rules, and to what degree does DM fiat fall into that? DM fiat, for anyone who doesn't know, is the idea that it's the dungeon master or the game master is supplying a lot of situational resolutions to things. You run into a wall, I say, oh, well, this one's a 3d6 wall, I'm going to roll that. And then the next one, you're like, oh, this is a 10d6 one. And everyone's like, wait, I thought walls were 3d6 walls. And that kind of thing. And then it, you know, gives you uneven stuff, but it also, you know, so that's DM fiat. So, all right, Stephen, so take it away. Give me your side of the description of a good game.
Well, in a lot of ways, I think you've sort of nailed it, or at least my philosophy on it is players, whether they should or not, like to have an idea of how the game world works. And so if they come across one wall and it's, a 3d6 or a DC 10, and then they come across what seems to be the similar wall, and all of a sudden the DC's higher, or you've got to roll more dice or whatnot, they just kind of go bullshit, right? And I'm sympathetic to that, but over time I also and I like to find ways around it. Like I'll say the wall's more difficult in some ways and whatnot to kind of help the players move that along. At the same time, we're working on Pathfinder Second Edition right now, and there in third edition, and even fourth edition was a little bit different with this, is, we give you a list of DCs and the skills, common sort of DCs and the skills. It's, this is what it takes to climb a tree. This is what it takes to, swim across a river and whatnot. Realizing that some of those DCs seem terribly punitive at lower levels and might seem way too easy for the challenges that a GM wants to create later on. So, I mean, we're taking a lot of that background math and making it more GM explanation, sitting there and saying, think about what you've done before. Here are, easy, hard, severe DCs at various levels. Realize that if, at fifth level they climbed a wall easier, you're going to have to make walls more difficult somehow, and give them some ideas of doing that. So giving them tools to adjust the story where the players just don't go, why is this harder now? It seems like the same wall. What am I not seeing? So I think once upon a time, I used to think that, DCs were DCs, and that's what it is. And you're explaining something in the world. And then one day, probably while I was working on or as helping out with the 3.5 revision, it sort of occurred to me that the illusion is that somehow games are creating a physics, that you're looking through a telescope into the world and then describing it in the rules. That's kind of the illusion that a lot of people sort of play on. And the reality of it is we just make this shit up. And so it was better to give the GM more tools to create a narrative physics rather than trying to explain this imaginary world in sort of Newtonian certainty.
Now, so one of the things that I've had, and I've had a lot of people ask me about how it works when you have different, walls of different descriptions, and I like. In some ways, a wall is a good example because there's not a whole lot of variation in walls. But, I may want to have one that's, 100 feet high, made of ice, the sort of thing that's really, mythical, that only the serious, heroes of Norse legend are going to be able to get up that wall. And despite immersion, this is one of the areas where I open the curtain and show the players some of the things that I'm doing in terms of probability, because I will say to them outright, well, you're taking a look in this wall and you figure you're going to have to roll a 6 on a 6-sider in order to climb this one. And later I might be like, well, no, this is the wall of the gods. You're going to need to roll a 20 on a 20-sider in order to get up. And so that's from the so-called old school DM fiat perspective, because that's DM fiat in operation, doing it the way I'm describing. And so that would appear to be very much the same thing that you're doing now, I guess, in the second edition of Pathfinder, except that what you're doing is you're using descriptive tools instead of telling them the actual numbers.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's part of my theory, and this is not always possible because of the way we play the games and sometimes how we prepare for the games. But the best kind of GM fiat is in actual adventure design, right? And of course that's really easy to say. But in the midst of you preparing your game, you're not going to know everything your players are going to ask. You're not going to think about it, right? When you've got six heads kind of looking at the same imaginary object, whether it's described by your words or miniatures on a map, you're not going to be able to troubleshoot all of that. But the goal is to give mostly newer GMs, a lot of GMs who've done this for a long time, know the perils and the tricks to get around it, but give them those tools in adventure design so they critically start looking at that and going, well, the players are going to want to try to climb this. I better figure that out. How difficult do I want it to climb it? What kind of levels of variation can we give you? Luckily, the world and walls, they seem pretty simple, but they have a lot of variation in real life. And then letting them answer some of those questions while they're preparing the game, and then giving them quick reference tools for when they're playing the game if they have to answer it on the fly. So yeah, because adventure design is the greatest form of GM fiat. And if we can express those things quickly, elegantly, and easily referenced, then we can not only help people when they make adventures, but also while they're running it to go, hold on just a second, right? Or, those of us, well, not like me, that have, picture perfect memory, can just go, oh yeah, no, yeah. So, and be able to do things on the fly and change things and give everybody, the kind of experience where they walk away and say, wow, that's one of the best games I ever played. And geez, Matt's really on the ball. And that was just, that was just wonderful. I'm an optimist. I think we can do that. We're definitely pushing to do it. I think, all of the role-playing games that are out there do it to one degree or another, but there's so much design headspace that goes in making sure players are happy with all of their options. A lot of times the GM stuff gets relegated towards the end. And by that time you're like, oh, geez, all right, what do we tell GMs? And the funny thing about GMs is sometimes they're really hard to give tools to. Mostly the ones who've done it for a while, because they're like, yeah, I know. I don't need to read through this book. And they're of course very busy because they have a vision in their head, and they want to present it in a fun way. And they more than players, they tend to go, oh, those game designers, they don't know anything.
Yeah, definitely. That's the more and more you play the games, the more and more you see the game designer as just being kind of the partner in the whole thing.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
Which I think that's good actually, but it certainly creates the stumbling block in a couple of areas, like not reading the GM section and not finding the stuff that really would be pretty helpful if you knew that how it integrated into the players stuff that you read for the basic rules. But
no, absolutely.
I'm real interested by the idea of the game's adventure design being a form of DM fiat. I hadn't really thought about it that way before. And I see once again not a split between you and me, but between the sort of poles of the old school people and then some later forms of adventure design, in that you've got your old schooler who says, okay, well, yes, this adventure is DM fiat on my part, but we're going to play a sandbox game where you can go anywhere you want. And then of course they're having to respond to the players on the fly because they just rolled a 77, and so that means griffins, which means that you had no idea that it was going to be griffins until 5 seconds ago. So
right.
So that's one. Does the level of complexity in rule systems where you have defined numbers for all the various things like trees and walls, and here I'm talking about third and fourth and current edition Pathfinder, not so much with the one that you're working on for Pathfinder. But does that array of numbers require that your adventure be more channeled, whereas using a simpler rule system, you might griffins in 5 seconds?
Yeah, although I would also say that there are tricks around it. So for instance, like, let's take old AD&D, and you were doing a sandbox thing, and in the back of all of the monster books, they had those long, crazy encounter tables.
That's exactly what I'm thinking about. I mean, that's what I had in mind with the example. So you and I both probably turned to that page.
Oh yeah, and in a lot of ways, those encounter tables were absolutely crazy, because you could get a range of just absolutely nut stuff, where it was either a very unsatisfactory encounter because you got 2 orcs and they're all 8th level, and it's all, and unless the GM decided to run some comical orcs that could give them ideas about what's going on beyond, or give them rumors, or just have a funny weird combat, you were all like, well, that took about 2 minutes and wasn't that fulfilling. Or you could have a Baylor show up and it's all like, well, I guess we're not going there. I think in games like 3.5 Pathfinder, and even 4th edition to some extent, what the solution to that would be is to have shorter, more focused encounter tables that allowed the GM to know exactly, within a broader swath. It's not like I'm going to run this encounter today, but I know that there are 10 things on my list. There are surprises, but fewer surprises, and you give that illusion of anything could happen while still knowing exactly what could happen in your back pocket.
Whereas if you're relying on the actual large anything goes encounter table, then pretty much anything could happen.
Right. Which in theory, and sometimes even in practice, sounds like the world is your oyster. Like you're never going to know what happened. And having that illusion is great for players and can be very frustrating for GMs, mostly.
I think it's vital. I think it's absolutely vital for players.
Oh yeah.
I would think if there's anything, the most important thing about running a game is that they feel that they are in a living world where it's not being handed to them and it's not being shaped around them. It's that they are taking on the world.
Yes.
And that they are winning. And so, and so that, and to that degree, I occasionally wonder whether my, often focusing on sandboxing and the GM fiat on the rules resolution is something where I'm trying to keep that as true as possible. Whereas I think anyone knows that there are going to be ways, shapes, and forms in which absolutely no DM can truly simulate an entire world on the fly, and there have to be shortcuts. And so what you and I talk about when there's the differences between the degree of GM fiat, or whether you're focusing on descriptions and I'm just like, hey, I'm going to make some numbers up, but I'll at least tell you ahead of time and you can decide whether you want to roll. All of that stuff, what that has to do with, it seems to me, is where and how do you use your shortcuts that everyone has to have in simulating that world?
Yeah. No, and I think that's really important. And part of the fun thing about being a GM and honing your craft over time is finding out what shortcuts work best for you. I mean, there's the old saying that a group of role players can't agree on what to put on a pizza. And I think the same is true for GMs. And it's one of the reasons why it's really hard to give good GM advice, is because GMs are very independent, sometimes very arrogant. I mean, after all, you're creating entire worlds. You have a small pocket of devoted fans who look forward to sitting around your table every week and having the agency to explore your creation. So I used to write this column for Dungeon Magazine called Save My Game. And one of the hardest parts, because it was all about GM advice, is giving people the glimmer of advice without telling them this is the way you should do it. Because, you know, if you think you know the absolute way for every GM to run a game, you're already doing it wrong. Because everybody's brain works a little bit differently. Everybody has emotional kicks that are a little bit different. And in a lot of ways, I tried to inspire GMs to find their own methods, to look at the relationship they had with their players in different ways. I made the analogy once that, I made two analogies that were a little bit controversial, but really fun. And the first was that you're not writing a novel, you're actually the showrunner for a reality show. Mm-hmm. And then the second one was that game groups were structured like terrorist cells, that they all had a grand plan, but they all were independent and wanted to do things differently. Mm-hmm. So, and those two axioms for giving GMs and advice on how to run better games has served me well, because both are in a lot of ways, the second is more provocative than the first in some ways, but they're absolutely true. And if you can understand that, I think you can give GMs at least a toolbox of solutions, rather than coming on high and saying you should run your game like this. I remember being a kid and reading a Dragon magazine, and every once in a while, because I think he felt trademark restraints and whatnot, Gary would write something like, "If you're not playing AD&D by the rules, you're not playing AD&D," which we all just went, "Well, that's garbage, right? Of course we're playing AD&D."
Right. Well, and of course that was, I think there were two things in that. One was that they were trying to get a tournament concept put together because they viewed it as chess. And then of course the other one was that a lot of people forget when they read stuff that Gary was writing, but he was a businessman, and he was at that point in time, there were a lot of potential competitors to Dungeons and Dragons, that were ripoffs that were coming out. So he was
and wolves at the door and everything. So as a young kid, I didn't understand that, and then going back and reading that stuff, being in the business for a while, I'm like, oh, I know what he was getting at. I think there was probably better ways to put it. And as someone who's designed tournament structures for role-playing games, that's extremely hard. And even then you have to be a little bit looser. You have to rely on your GMs, right? GMs are really, game designers like me, we like to think that we're the true authorities on the game, but in day-to-day practice, GMs are the king of their little kingdom. And it's important for us to guide them, but let them do things the way they want to do it. And that's a philosophy that we've really embraced with P2. In fact, sometimes in the current draft of the playtest rules, we'll sit there and even in player-facing stuff, we'll say the GM gets to choose. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of stuff that we're like, we kind of codify it in there. The GM gets to choose, and which will probably annoy some of our hardcore organized play players, because they try to build things where the GM, there's a lot of debates in P1 where it's the GM shouldn't make any decisions on their own. They should just stick to the text. But personally, I think that's garbage. The GMs are in a lot of ways really the rock stars. They put up with the players' crap. They create great experiences. They are your operating system in a lot of ways. And they're using an underlying program that they get from books, but their interpretation is the key to the success or failure of that, especially that first time experience when you're playing the game. If you've got a GM who is either uncertain or just not very good, you're going to come away from that first time you play a role-playing game and go, yeah, maybe it's not for me. And if you have a GM who can just make the system sing, you're more likely to have that person come back and play again and again and again.
Okay, well, since we're using computer analogies too, let me come into that. So, I don't write game rules. I'm pretty well known for Swords and Wizardry, but that was really just taking Gary's original D&D and rewriting it in new words, so that it would be out there. I don't claim to have the chops of a game designer, but in terms of, but since you are Let me ask you a question. So you've talked about a couple of things. You talked about the DM's craft and the fact that there is an art to it, and that there are various things, to understand and not understand. And then you're talking about the system here. Do you try and hardwire? Let's say you have something that you think is a good piece of advice for a DM.
Mm-hmm.
Do you try and hardwire that into the rules at all, or sometimes, or
sometimes, mostly with P1, we'd usually do that by relegating it to a subsystem. So, and it can be anything from we have we have a social combat deck, and we've got kind of social combat rules. What happens if you enter a debate, and using the existing D20 system to simulate a sort of pseudo combat that is more role playing oriented. Or hexploration, or downtime systems where you can gain influence and everything else. But even then, we tend to sit there and say, here's a system that you can use. We know a lot of you like it a little bit more freeform, or at least this is a system that you can pick apart and go, oh, it gives me some ideas to run along. And sometimes, we've put those in adventure paths, or even use them in organized play adventures. But I think as a team, and myself in particular, we kind of view those are tools that you could use. And even in a lot of ways, no GM runs combat really the same way. I tend to be a little bit fast and furious with my combat, reasons like that, because I like the amount of information that I can convey to my players, that I don't have to say. But Mark Seifter on our 10 combats, and he's got this, mathematically very precise mind, and he can he sort of looks at it first person, and runs it incredibly well that way, in a way that I would sit there and I'd be all like, I'd get lost, right? Even when I was playing first edition as a kid, I had a grid that I made from a chalkboard, and we were moving on squares and everything else, just because I enjoyed that flow of information. Mm-hmm. I'm very, in a lot of ways, as long as you tell the players how things work and how to expect, and the basic idea with the GMs is this is the system, this is the underlying program. I'm much more inclined to give the GM tools that they can either use if they're in a pinch, or they think it's cool, or that can inspire them to find their own way to run games. But I might be in the minority on that one.
I don't know. I mean, I think that's. I think with me, the question is more, do you give them systems, or do you give them just nuggets of ideas? Hey, you could do this, you could do that. Which again, not being a game designer, I can sit back and throw rocks at game designers.
Right. It's fun, and I like dodging rocks. It's a great pastime.
All right, so I'm still interested in this idea of the and feel free to derail, because you're allowed to derail conversations too. But one of the most interesting things to me that we have talked about was this idea of the simulating the world, and what are the different ways that one might take in order to simulate a world, and that they are going to differ from DM to DM. And so, one of mine was, I tell them the probabilities on something. I'll describe it real big, but then I'm going to tell them the probabilities that I've made up. What are some of the ones that you use?
I like, wherever I can, to use unreliable narrators. I guess you could say
those are great.
Yeah, sort of. Unreliable narrators. The idea that PCs can only get sort of a glimmer of what's happening, and then when it opens up, they go, "Oh, well, that was kind of true, but not really," and then have to adjust to it. And then even game mechanics wise, I used to, back when I was in college, I ran a lot of Forgotten Realms. I ran Undermountain, stuff like that. And the Volo's books came out, which I thought were really fun and really hilarious. And Volo was a bit of an unreliable narrator. He was always giving us that. And so we had a basically a procedural rule in our game that we called Volo's Law. And that is, if your turn is over and then you forgot about an ability or had a plus or a minus or didn't add it in, we all just went Volo's Law, which means things don't happen the right way all of the time.
Yeah.
So unreliable narrators. I love the use of kind of terrain and visuals. I'm a pretty decent miniature painter, and sometimes fool around with terrain and stuff. I like the visuals of the game. I think it adds to the fun. You know, I always like the look on my player's face when they come to a nice looking table and they're like, "Oh, what's this going to be?" Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Of course, and then, you know, I design map packs and flip mats for Paizo. Jason Engel makes them look pretty, but and that's a good way of you know, that over the years has given me a large group of tools that I can use to do that, and for other players to create really visually stunning games, because it's not only great.
For example.
So when I was
go ahead and take the drink.
Like when I was running the Pathfinder second edition playtest games at GaryCon, it was GaryCon, so I kind of wanted to run this random encounter sort of thing where I basically made 20 encounters and they were on decks and in envelopes, and then players would pick one and it would have the encounter name, and then I would set up the miniatures, and I used our two of our dungeon flip mats for that, and so it was really easy for players to kind of just grok it and go. And then even when we went to Gamma, we used one of the flip mats I designed for the sample adventure that we ran for retailers and distributors. And when we were running in the suite, when they would come up and everything was all set up and the miniatures were out and everything else, and they were all like, "Oh wow, this is serious," right? We just thought we were going to have a discussion about this and maybe roll some dice, but this looks really cool. I have a lot of Dwarven Forge, and so that I picked up for pretty deep discounts back in my Wizards of the Coast days, and then when the RPGA got rid of their Dwarven Forge, which they gave me a whole bunch as well. They're like, "We don't know what to do with it," and so I used to use that a lot. And so when my play group came over, I used to set up entire dungeon swaths or encounter swaths of what we're doing, and then put black felt over parts so they couldn't see, and the unveiling and everything else. I like the theater of that, and players like it too. And when you do it, like if I'm going to a store and doing a demo, it makes people stop and look, where, you know, once upon a time when it was just you know, a bunch of kids with a stack of books rolling weird dice, they might stop by the dice, but there was nothing visually to sort of get people to go, "What is this?" Right? Other than strange behavior for the time.
Yeah. Well, and you know, and there's obviously, you know, like you said, there's for the players too. There can be the theater of it to the players. I've seen different kinds of theater used with this too. So, for example, but you know, just the DM who acts out accents or is, you know, right up at the top of the table. You're watching that person. And that's one form of visual engagement with what's going on. And then you've got, you know, minis, you know, which is probably the obvious one. And now there are virtual tabletops that are addressing the question of how to put spectacle into that. I mean, the online games that I'm running right now on this channel, one of them is 5th edition, one of them is Swords and Wizardry, original D&D, and in those I've got Her Starts terrain, which you know, so it's basically Dwarven Forge, except that I'm pushing the camera through it at miniature's eye level.
I've watched those games. I'm a Patreon supporter.
So but the effect of that is that they're this fucking tall. So it looks like G.I. Joe terrain when you look at it on the actual table, because the problem is that the camera picks up the horizon And so,
Right.
you're going to see, people and bookshelves and things up at the top, unless you've got, some stuff. So this would be about the world's worst tabletop terrain ever, except for people who are if you had a table of people who are all 7 feet tall or taller. You could manage it. You're irritatingly tall from my perspective.
Well, Frank Mentor says the same thing to me all the time. He's like, "You are irritatingly tall." Thanks, Frank. He also says worse things to me, that guy. But yeah, I was wondering about that as I was watching the videos of you running your game. I'm like, that terrain seems unusually tall. So I'm kind of glad that you pulled it out. But
it is unusually tall.
But it works for what you're doing. I really got a kick out of watching those games, and I'm like, oh, that's a really sort of interesting way to do it. And as Paizo, we're creating a Twitch studio, although I'm not sure how many. I don't think it's big enough to run games in. And my girlfriend works at Penny Arcade, and they have a crazy studio where they run their Twitch stuff. And I think and they rent it out to other people. Like Skeeter did a BattleTech thing over there once that was a lot of fun to watch.
I was gonna ask, is that the same thing that where Skeeter was the BattleTech thing?
Yep, yeah, and that place is massive and well equipped and everything else. And so
I think Skeeter, if you look at the game industry, you can look at the whole thing as the story of Skeeter the Barbarian. He's like our Conan that just ends up in bizarre places, and you could just follow him around.
And in fact, I'm babysitting him tomorrow, so that'll be fun. And I don't know how you babysit Deadpool. I really just don't. So no, it's Skeeter's one of my best friends. He's a great guy, but it is kind of like that, and you never quite know what's going to happen when you're hanging out with Skeeter, which is part of the fun of it. But he's also one of the sweetest guys I know. Like,
he is. He absolutely is. I mean, that's that's the thing about Skeeter that is so much fun, is that you've got somebody who's just absolutely the toughest guy that and yet at the same time he's wonderful.
Yeah, he's that weird mix of friends that I really enjoy, and I've only had a few of them in my life, that if I ever needed a shoulder to cry on, I would go ahead and call Skeeter. And if I had to bury a body, I would call Skeeter.
Yeah, and that is an odd combination, that when it's the same person that you'd call to bury a body and that you'd cry on. That's
right. So yeah, and so watching you do that, I'm like, oh, now I kind of want to do that. How the hell do I go about doing that?
Oh God, you don't. It's really it's really a hassle, and right. I mean, the players love it. The people watching the videos love it, but you have to DM while at the same time you're worried about whether a cable is going to whether moving a cable is going to make a wall fall over.
Right.
Nobody needs that. When you're DMing, it would be a lot easier if it were just looking at a screen and talking to people. But visuals are really important, and it's when you're on screen, you can't see hand gestures nearly as well. I mean, I guess you could back out to somewhere like here and do it like this, but I really rely on lots of body motion when I'm DMing, because I'm inside the space, at convention games. So I'm like, so you're going around this corner here, and then you're, it's this part of the room, where they are, and you all are going over. It's big body movement, so you can't get that on a computer.
No. You need a dedicated minion, somebody who you train. Right, just get a kid in the neighborhood and sit there. I'll buy you a pizza, but you've got to learn how to push around this camera.
I have one dedicated minion already, and that's Zach.
Oh, okay.
Zach Glazer is my dedicated minion, and
right.
The problem is that I need two, or I need Zach to actually be here at my house instead of in Arizona, which is really irresponsible. God damn it, Zach.
Yeah, you should talk to Zach about that. Arizona, no bueno.
Well, he and Chuck are both there now, so I'm a little concerned that all of the people who are with Frog God Games are eventually going to end up being really, really old in that one part of Arizona.
Well, a lot of my friends have talked about when we get old, just taking over a retirement community where we can just game all the time.
Yeah, compound is what we
Yeah,
need.
yeah, and and Skeeter can guard it
Yeah.
to make sure nobody unsavory gets in, or quote unquote unsavory, at least in our measure. But yeah, no, I think that would be the best sort of retirement thing. Roll dice, push around things, large hand gestures, crazy miniatures. It'd be fun.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll tell you, the last since I started working on these two games, so now I've got a lot of game time running, and so I'm right in the middle of a world. Probably not as much really as I have been since middle school, and that's a lot of fun. It's a change of pace from writing, which I really need to get back to. But
yeah, that is the problem. Like Beth, she was like, you used to run a regular game and you don't anymore. And I'm like, yeah, but I do a lot more freelance writing. And and I'm working on my own game and stuff like that. And a lot of times, if you're running a lot, you're not writing a lot. And if you're not, and if you're writing a lot, you're not running a lot. Unless except for the conventions I go to. I've got a lunchtime Pathfinder 2 playtest game where we're doing Temple of Elemental Evil, and we've been doing that for nearly 2 years now. And then I run games at conventions, and that's about it. I've got some of my friends who used to work for Magic, who are big sort of, we want to break every system we ever find. They want to play my new game and try to break it, and that's going to be fun. I've got another group of friends who I've made recently, some of whom either work or are spouses of people that work at Penny Arcade, and they're like, you need to run a game for us. And I'm like, yeah, great. I have no idea when I'm going to have the time to do.
Yeah, exactly. And plus, occasionally, I mean, I've had periods of time where it felt like work to game. That was really bad. But for a while, sometimes that hit me. So I'm like, okay, now I'm here to play D&D. This is my day job.
Right. I mean, yeah, and it can be really daunting. Mostly if you have sort of a regular game at a regular time and everything else. And there are just some weeks where work has been bad, or you've just got things piled up, and you can feel the stress of like, oh crap, I've got 5 or 6 people coming over to my house. The house is a mess. I want to present a good game, and it can really stress you out if you don't manage your time well, or things happen in your work week where you can't manage your time well. Real life, it's getting in the way of games.
You're gonna have to keep talking for a moment, because if my dog's gonna be barking like that, I have to be on mute. So it's all you. Take control of the show.
Now you're putting me on the spot. I think I'm well, if I'm going to be on the show, then I'm going to
yeah, it's your show. You do your thing, whatever it is.
A little bit for my day job, and tell people that Pathfinder 2, the playtest, is coming in August. There will be a free PDF you can download if you're one of those people who likes books. We've got 3 options for you. And we would appreciate it if you played the crap out of it. Tell us what you like, what you don't like, where you thought we went right, where you thought we went wrong, so we can produce the next best edition of Pathfinder for you folks. So,
are those books going to be available in August, or that's when a formal sort of playtesting thing starts?
Yes and yes. So the playtest starts, I think, August 6th. We're releasing it at Gen Con. It goes out immediately in PDF. And then we're going to have a soft cover book that has a pretty cheap price point. And I think it's like 28 something or other. I didn't bring the press release. Normal hardback book with a nice Wayne Reynolds cover. The softback book will have it too. And then one of those special leather editions for folks who like those, because a lot of folks like those. So.
Y'all are coming out with a new, I saw something, is it an adventure path or something like that y'all are just publishing? Isn't that going to really hurt sales, that people are looking forward to a future edition and seeing this current stuff they've got as maybe being obsolete, even though they don't have a replacement?
Well, Yes and no, I would say. Our adventure paths are extremely popular. We are going, I think our last adventure path also talks about how we're pushing forward the story into the next edition, and it will be popular. And I can't say much about that because we haven't announced the last two adventure paths yet. But the adventure path team is really good at finding great ways to get people excited just about the story of the games that they're releasing. So I don't think we're going to see that big of a dip.
That's good.
People are still going to want to see what the story is and play those stories. I mean, heck, we do 2 adventure paths a year. If you're one of those groups that has kept up with every single one of our adventure paths, you're playing at a good clip. Most groups, they sort of pick and choose the adventure path based on the story or their level of interest in the game world.
Now, you mentioned in there your own game that you were working on. We were talking, Stephen and I were at the same time at GaryCon and talking about this. And so, you've, and this is the game where you were saying, oh yeah, there may be a little bit of overlap and, relationship and, common DNA with Pathfinder 2 from your game. Tell us about your game.
It's called Delve. It's what I'd like to call old school feel with kind of new school mechanics. It's a D20 game. It uses the 3-act system, which I designed for Pathfinder Chained originally, that we're also using a version of in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. This one uses a different one. There's a lot of kind of underlying structure and procedures in it. But it also doesn't use Vancian magic. It uses a different initiative system. It's major differences in the presentation of monsters and stuff in the story. It's got a much different, implied setting and whatnot. So, because most of my career has been dealing with, these role-playing games that you roll a d20 and you want to roll high. A lot of it is kind of my sketch pad for design, things I want to try out, and then I'll run it and go, that's not working quite right. Let's take it back to the drawing board. A lot of the things that I
because you have to do with games the same thing that I would do with adventures. That I'll run a little bit of it and be like, oh, that sucks. I'm gonna make a change. You actually have to do that with entire games. Yeah.
So for instance, one of the things from the GaryCon adventure I ran is my reactions are not doing as much work as I want them to do. Because my initiative system is not a roll a d20 and put it in an order. It's bad guys go first, good guys go second, and you can spend an action to call it with a heroic surge to go first. And you only get 3 actions. You don't get an automatic reaction. I found that I was being far too conservative with my reactions. They need to do more work. They have to have a bigger effect, or they're just not considered in play. And so my big going back to the drawing board after that show is looking at my reactions and seeing if I can make them a little bit more fun and more usable. And I'm probably gonna write a blog on that in the somewhat near future.
Where do you blog so that people can take a look at that if they haven't?
It is delve-rpg.com.
All right, cool. And I'll put that also in the comments, the description of the video down below, folks. So,
right. I even had a good friend of mine from Texas, and I played with him at Alcon, and he had played Delve, and he had been reading the stuff on Pathfinder RPG or the Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And he was all like, was Delve just a playtest for Pathfinder 2? And I'm like, no, not really. But I worked on both systems. I have the, same kind of, I'm going through the same thought routine. There are similarities, but there are also a great number of differences. It's my sanity too, right? I work for a brand. I work with a lot of people. There are conflicting points of views. And it's my way to just sort of go nuts. In a way that I have to be a little bit more conservative at work because it's a brand and I'm making games for other people. Delve, if if I can make Delve eventually be commercially successful, I'd be overjoyed. But a lot of it is just a work of love.
Now let me jump in there too. When you were talking about working at a company and the effect of having to work with other people and with customers, because we run into that. I run into that especially as well. It's really nice to come out with something that is absolutely your own. It's exactly the way that you wanted it to be. And now when I do that, of course, the result is that my art is sort of stick figure art, because that's the best I can do on getting exactly what I want it to be. But there's an enormous joy in coming up with something that was really what you wanted to do. I'm going to even publish a couple of things from those online games, and just put them, probably minimal layout and just put it out there. But that's very different for doing something, with Frog God's Lost Lands campaign, where it has to fit here, there, canon, blah blah blah. I can just sort of do the thing.
Yeah, definitely. It's very much the same thing. It also allows me, because I do the narrative side as well. I've written one adventure path for Hell's Vengeance, which was really well received. A Starfinder adventure path is that I wrote. The 13th Gate is coming out soon. I do like doing the narrative stuff as well, although I think my talents are far stronger in actual system design. But yeah, being able to just have the freedom to just do whatever. I was talking to my buddy Rob Schwalb, who he did Demon Lord with that kind of same thing in mind. He just wanted to make a game that was his, because we worked together at Wizards of the Coast. We love talking game design and theory and everything else. And he's like, well, you don't really have a budget for art. I was, and you're not going to kickstart it for a while. What are you going to do for art? And I said, I think I'm just going to leave blank spaces with the art order. And he goes, what? And I'm like, yeah, you're right. I'm like, eventually, when you guys start giving me money for this thing, I'll put the art in. But for right now, you're just going to have to use your imagination, kind of like you did in the old days. And even then, I think I want to go back black and white and make it look, sort of like an upshot, sort of old school. If you have colored pencils and want to color it in, that's great. You could do it. But my nostalgia for that period of time of me discovering games is pretty strong, and I think that aesthetic is cool.
Well, it's not just nostalgia on that one either. I mean, that's the thing is, look, when you're looking at something that's color art, it's like you're looking at the world.
Yeah.
Okay. When you look at something that is black and white art, you're looking at a book about that world.
Mm-hmm.
Those are two equally valid ways of getting into the whole thing. I mean, that grimoire quality.
Yeah.
Of that, and when Gary would write, I mean, this is how I first ran. I ran into D&D two different ways and didn't know it. I'd seen it played at conventions, because when I was like 10, I was doing Napoleonic wargaming. So I was at a couple of those conventions, saw people playing D&D, thought that looked interesting, didn't get into it. And then back at the hobby store where I was looking at my Napoleonics, here's this monster manual thing. And I didn't know what it was, because it wasn't in a box, and games were in boxes, not in books. And so I figured, okay, this is maybe some sort of wargaming reference book, and read through it. And it's wonderful, this sort of mix of rules and yet this sort of feeling that it's an encyclopedia of another world that you're looking at, with, almost medieval pictures in the whole thing. And even though you then say, an ogre does, an ogre has 4+1 hit dice, which was of course meaningless. You get into the world through that grimoire black and white quality in a way that is just as strong, I think, as it is for seeing color pictures that are allowing you to sort of photo flash into the world.
Right. I kind of think, and that it allows for a more diverse imagination of what that world actually is, right? When you have that sort of codex quality, it's a reporting of the world rather than trying to show you a window into that world. I find that interesting in today's age of very slick high-end graphics and whatnot. I almost worry that kind of view is more nostalgia and kind of antiquated, but I also don't care.
which is a very important thing when you're looking at nostalgia.
Right. So,
But I
yeah.
don't think it is altogether nostalgia. I mean, there's certainly a big nostalgia component to it, but there's a valid design thought there too.
Yeah. I'm cautiously optimistic about that, but deep in my mind, I'm just like, well, it might just be because that's what I grew up with. I'm very, a lot of times, and I have to be this as I do kind of as I do game design. One of my first things is go back and do rules archaeology. How did this start? When did this come to be? What can I figure out what the design decisions were? Is there lessons to be learned there, and traps and pitfalls, or old wisdom that's just forgotten? And I think so much game design after D&D came out as sort of a rejection of kind of that design, and like, why are we doing it that way? And I think that actually can be really useful. But I find myself more and more, it's all like, why was that decision made? Like, I don't understand it now. I want to go back and understand it, because more often than not, I find that there's some wisdom there. And that wisdom might be, don't ever do it again. But, I kind of want to...
Weapon speed factors.
Yeah, weapon speed factors. Definitely one. Or the various AD&D segments in combat, and the various sort of bits that we really all kind of ignored when we were playing the game. The old school Revolution stuff I find really fascinating, because it really is most of the mechanics, except for the ones that nobody used, right? It's almost, in some ways, it's almost pure forms of the game. Because it really goes back and says, yeah, we didn't do that. We did something more like, and sometimes even like what they did in third edition. So we're going to grab a little bit of that, put it there, because it's just easier to use, and it makes the game flow a little bit better.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the OSR, what it is it's a lot of different things, because some of it is the guys who are playing, with old first edition books. Who do they talk to? Other people who play with first edition books, but also, here are some people who might be playing, original D&D, and there's just, you find all kinds of different commonalities and points. But I think it's the only way that I can, that I tend to describe the OSR is that it's about a particular style of play. It's a freestyle kind of play, and it's generally more DM fiat than player agency in terms of the freeform, the freestyle nature of it. But there's a lot of people who would define it different ways. I mean, another easy definition is just all the rule sets before third, throw it in there. But, or just, there are people who are like, it has to look like the old stuff. I don't care if it's Pathfinder. Give me something that looks like it's vintage, black and white stuff, Arrow Lotus doing it, and that's my thing, is the retro feel to it. And some people, it's pure nostalgia, and so it's a real hard thing to pin down. But yeah, I think there's been a lot of that. Let's find the game that we actually played and see a design for that, because I think that was definitely Castles and Crusades approach, and an awful lot of Castles and Crusades has shown up in 5th edition D&D, and then you've got Joe Goodman's DCC is a little bit like that. I mean, he sort of went back to the beginning on the literature on the whole thing, and did a bunch of redesigning. But most people think of that as being an old school game. It's interesting stuff.
Well, it's definitely had an effect, and your observation about 5th edition, I think, is entirely correct. Is when the final design, when that solidified, is basically, where can we take the best of everything from the various versions of D&D, and being a designer, I have, and being friends with a lot of the folks who made that game, I have my quibbles. I'm like, I don't know if I would do that.
Throw rocks at him. Throw rocks at him.
Throw rocks at him. And I guess you could say, in a lot of ways, one of our goals with Pathfinder is to make it Pathfinder, but have a better line between that sort of player agency and GM fiat, right? Can we find a really good middle ground where GMs feel empowered to tell the stories that they want to tell through the game, and players still have that agency that Pathfinder players seem to love. Like, and I think we're at least going in the right direction on that, or at least I hope so.
Excellent. Well, let's get together again next time that it fits in your schedule, and maybe what we'll do is because we really didn't talk much about player agency, and that's an interesting one to throw into the mix as well. So let's plan on getting together at another date fairly soon and talking through some more stuff.
Oh, that sounds great. I would enjoy that immensely.
All right. Well, say goodbye to your fans, because I'm gonna take us off the air and into the no longer live section of the Hangout. Say goodbye to everyone.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you very much, and play the crap out of P2.
Play the crap out of P2. Okay, so the message is out there. The more you play it, the better it'll be.
Yep.
And I will say to everybody, no matter what kind of Dungeons and Dragons it is that you play, imagine the hell out of it.